She was only supposed to stay 1 hour. The snow had started falling softly that night, like feathers drifting from a wound in the sky. The town of Millfield was silent, as it often was after dusk, its streets buried in white stillness, the kind that swallowed footsteps and secrets alike. The orphanage stood at the end of Rose Hill Road, a crumbling red brick building surrounded by pine trees that whispered when the wind moved through them. Next to it, divided by a narrow iron gate, was St. Brigitte's convent, small, old, quiet. 5 sisters lived there in modest devotion, led by the eldest, Sister Agatha, whose voice was rarely heard beyond the chapel walls. But that night, Sister Maria, the youngest among them, just 25, walked through that iron gate after evening prayers. She said she was going to visit the children. She had promised them bedtime songs, as she often did on Wednesdays. Her voice was gentle and melodic, like winter light through stained glass. She never came back. The next morning, her bed was untouched, her boots were still damp near the fire, and the old wooden gate between the convent and the orphanage hung, ajar, swinging faintly, though the wind had stopped long ago. At first, the police said she had likely run away, a young woman overwhelmed by the vows, the silence, the seclusion. They searched the woods, the lake, the road out of town. Nothing, not a scrap of fabric, not a sound. The sisters kept silent. They locked the gate permanently. The children were told not to ask questions, and for 4 long years, they didn't. Until one morning, a child, so now 9 years old, drew something. He placed the paper silently on the desk of Sister Agnes, the schoolteacher. Crayons, red, black, and white. A drawing of Sister Maria, standing in the hallway of the orphanage. But the hallway wasn't empty, there was something else behind her, something no one could explain. It looked like a figure, tall, dark, watching. The boy pointed to the date scribbled at the top corner of the paper. It was the exact night Sister Maria vanished. No one had spoken to him about that night. No one had dared. But when they asked him what it meant, he simply whispered, "She didn't leave. She was taken." The drawing was taken from him, hidden, but it wouldn't be the last time he drew her face, and it wouldn't be the last time someone saw her again. Not in the way they hoped, not in the way they prayed, but in the way that chills the blood, because sometimes absence leaves fingerprints behind, and silence carries echoes. It was not just the absence of her voice that haunted the convent halls. It was the way the silence changed shape after Sister Maria vanished. Before that night, St. Brigitte's convent had known silence as something sacred, like prayer settling in the bones. But after her disappearance, silence turned into something else entirely. It became a weight, a presence, something that breathed just behind the walls. Sister Agatha tried to continue the routines as before. Morning bell, scripture at breakfast, embroidery after Vespers, but nothing truly returned to normal. There was a fragile dissonance in everything they did, like a song playing out of tune, just softly enough to leave your nerves unsettled. And then came the nights. The nights were worst. Sister Judith, the eldest after Agatha, confessed privately that she had started waking up at 3:11 a.m. every night, always the same time. No reason, no sound, just a pulse in her chest, as if something had brushed her soul from within. She began to light extra candles near her bed, and though she never admitted it to the others, she started sleeping with her crucifix clutched against her chest, not in reverence, but in fear. Sister Evelyn reported hearing footsteps on the chapel tiles, heavy, deliberate. One step, pause, another, then nothing. Once, she ran to the door expecting to find Sister Agatha doing her nightly rounds, but the hallway was dark and cold, too. Cold for a summer evening. The furnace had not gone out, the air somehow had. The youngest of the sisters, Sister Helena, found herself avoiding the west corridor, the one closest to the gate that led to the orphanage. She claimed it smelled strange, like ash and something else, something wet. No one asked further. No one wanted to know, because to ask would mean acknowledging the truth, that they had all felt it, that the silence had changed, and something had come with it. But what none of them knew, not then, was that Sister Maria had left something behind. Not a letter, not a sign, but an energy, faint and fractured, the kind that clings to places where prayers were once whispered in despair. Her room remained untouched, by order of Sister Agatha, the blankets still folded with precision, her small mirror left hanging on the nail above the wash basin, her rosary still coiled atop her pillow, as if waiting for fingers that would never return. But in the mirror, there was something odd, a faint streak, almost like fog, that no one could wipe away. No matter how often it was cleaned, it always returned, like breath, like memory, like someone still trying to speak. And over time, one by one, each of the sisters found themselves drawn to that mirror. They didn't talk about it, but they went, each at different hours, each hoping to see nothing, each afraid they might see everything. And in those still moments, standing before the mirror, hearts beating like drums behind ribs, they all asked the same thing, not out loud but in silence that echoed through their souls. "Are you still here?" Some nights the mirror gave no answer. Other nights as it seemed to darken, as if the silver inside had swallowed light whole. What happens to a place when someone vanishes without saying goodbye? What happens to a soul that never had a chance to scream? The convent began to shrink from the inside, not in bricks or beams but in spirit. Meals became shorter, conversations thinned, laughter, once soft and rare, disappeared altogether. Even the candles seemed to burn lower. It was as though something unseen had drawn the warmth out of their lives and left behind only chill. Grief has a way of changing people, but not knowing, that's what shatters them. It leaves no closure, no final prayer, no blessing of the body. Just a question that wakes you in the middle of the night with hands trembling and a mouth full of invisible dust. Where did she go? Why didn't she scream? What was she trying to protect? They all asked it, and none dared say it aloud. But the children at the orphanage, they felt it too. They stopped singing at night. They refused to sleep in the east wing and the one closest to the gate. And when one little girl, a shy 6-year-old named Clara, was asked what frightened her most at night, she replied without blinking, "The tapping." "What tapping?" they asked. "On the window when the moon is gone." "What do you see?" Clara tilted her head and whispered, "A face. I think she's lost, but she's not alone." It was snowing the last time someone saw her smile. Not the kind of snow that buries, the kind that dances, the kind that makes children press their hands to the glass and forget for just a moment that they're alone in the world. That evening, Sister Maria arrived at the orphanage just after supper, wearing her grey wool shawl and carrying a worn leather hymn book. Her boots squeaked on the linoleum floor as she stepped into the main hall. The lights flickered once. No one noticed. She had always been gentle with the children, especially the smaller ones. They clung to her sleeves. They whispered her name like a secret. Sister Marie. Her voice held something they didn't hear in anyone else's. Not just care, not just softness, but safety, the kind that made you believe angels might really watch you sleep. Clara was one of the first to run to her that night. She hugged Sister Maria's waist and begged for the dream song. That's what they called it, a lullaby Sister Maria had learned from her own mother long before she took her vows. No one else in the convent knew the melody. It had no name, it had no author, it just was. She sang it to them, by candlelight. One by one they fell asleep on thin mattresses with stuffed animals that had no eyes or missing arms. Only Clara stayed awake. She remembered something strange. Sister Maria paused mid-song. Her eyes flicked toward the hallway, her head tilted, like she was listening to something Clara couldn't hear. "Is someone there?" she whispered. But no one answered. The hallway was still. Sister Maria kissed Clara's forehead and told her to close her eyes, that she would come back after checking the other rooms. But she didn't. Clara waited. Minutes passed. The candles burned low. At some point, she fell asleep with the sound of Sister Maria's footsteps still echoing in her mind. They were light, then slow, then gone. That was the last known moment of Sister Maria's presence, The next morning, the sisters found her hymn book left on the pew inside the orphanage's small chapel, a place rarely used, with warped wood floors and a leaking ceiling, a place even the children avoided. Inside the hymn book was a scrap of paper that didn't belong, not a prayer, not a note, but a small piece of cloth, deep blue, torn at the edge, with a stitched red symbol unlike anything anyone recognized. A spiral, crude, uneven. It looked almost childlike, but not quite. They hid it. Sister Agatha burned the cloth behind the convent without explanation, and she never spoke of it again. But that wasn't the only thing left behind. In the chapel, hidden beneath the seat cushion of the third pew, the one Sister Maria always chose when she needed time alone, someone found a page, just one, from a diary. It had no name, no date, but the handwriting was unmistakably hers. The dreams are getting worse. I know they come from the orphanage, but I don't know if they're mine or someone else's. The faces, the eyes, they keep whispering in my sleep. I can't pray it away. Last night I woke up and my window was open. I remember locking it. I always lock it. The wind was still, but I could hear something moving outside. It wasn't an animal, it was too slow, too careful. The children draw things, but when I ask, they say they don't remember. I don't think I'm imagining it anymore. God forgive me, but I think something else is here. That page was also burned, but before it turned to ash, Sister Evelyn copied it by hand into her private journal. She never told anyone, not until it was too late. That same week, several of the younger children at the orphanage began drawing strange images. They called it the Watcher. Always a tall shape in the hallway. No face, just shadows. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bell, dismissed it as imagination, but one night she heard the front door creak. She assumed it was the wind, until she saw something in the mirror above the fireplace, a reflection, behind her, tall, unmoving. When she turned, nothing. But her heart kept pounding for hours after, and the next morning she quit without notice. Millfield's sheriff at the time was a man named Ernest Taylor. He dismissed the drawings, the dreams, the old symbols. There's no crime, just a missing girl and too much superstition, he said. But his deputy found him one night alone in his cruiser, staring at the orphanage gates. When asked what he was doing, Sheriff Taylor only muttered, "Listening." "To what?" the deputy asked. "To see if she's still singing." And then he drove off without another word. They said Sister Maria had simply left, but her song was still heard, in empty rooms, at odd hours. And sometimes, even now, 4 years later, the children whisper, "She comes when the candles go out." 4 years later, the winter had returned to Millfield, but it didn't fall gently like it used to. The snow came down heavy now, wet, cold and fast, as if the sky itself wanted to bury something it once tried to ignore. Daniel Crane hadn't been back in over a decade. He had left Millfield the moment his mother died, a quiet woman who used to volunteer at the orphanage. She had grown sick, slowly, painfully, and spent her final days whispering prayers she never finished. Daniel never understood why she always asked about the girl who sang. Not until now. He wasn't sure what brought him back. Maybe the letter from Sister Agatha, written in trembling script and sealed in wax. Maybe the news of the fire in the old convent kitchen, the one that didn't spread but left a single wall blackened with ash, in the shape of a spiral. Or maybe it was the feeling that something unfinished had been left in his name, because tucked into the back of that letter was a photo, faded, damaged, of Sister Maria, smiling, with him. Daniel didn't remember her, but he remembered the song, and that was enough. It was nearly dusk when he stepped through the rusted gate of the orphanage. Everything smelled like thyme and dust. The wind was still, but the trees shook as if warning him, as if trying to speak without words. The building had long been shut, down deemed unsafe after a series of unexplained breakages. Locks jamming, windows shattering from the inside out, light bulbs bursting in rooms no one had entered. But the front door, it wasn't locked. He placed his hand on the knob, expecting resistance. It turned without effort, and as the door creaked open, something cold brushed past his legs. He turned fast. Nothing. But the candles inside the Foyer, those long-forgotten altar candles in the wall sconces, flickered, lit. He should have left then, but he didn't. The orphanage hadn't been touched in years, yet the air wasn't stale, it was oddly recent. Dust still clung to the pews in the small chapel. But one of the Bibles was open, to Psalm 88. "You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths." Daniel closed it slowly. Something moved upstairs. A soft drag, like cloth pulled across wood. The staircase groaned under his boots. He took each step with care, not because he feared breaking it, but because something inside him whispered that he wasn't alone. At the top of the stairs, the east hallway stretched in both directions. Faint light streamed through the broken window at the end, gold-orange from the sinking sun. Then music, distant, barely audible, the sound of humming, a melody with no words, familiar. He turned toward it, heart racing, and followed the sound to the last door on the left. It was slightly ajar. Inside, a child's bed, a cracked mirror, and a notebook lying open on the floor, not dusty. Fresh. He knelt and picked it up. The page read, "She never left. I saw her. He made her sing." Then a sound behind him. A slow knock. 3 taps. On the window. He turned, but the window was closed, and behind the glass there was only reflection, his own face pale and unsure, and something else behind it, a shape, a veil, gone in a blink. Daniel staggered back, breath shallow, notebook still in his hand. He descended the stairs fast, trying to convince himself that what he saw was memory, oddity, or fear, not presence. But as he reached the foyer again, the hymn book was waiting for him, open, on the floor, and though he had never learned the notes, he could hear the melody in his head, clear, melancholy, calling him back. Daniel stands in the doorway holding the notebook. The wind is still, but the veil from the mirror is now folded on the banister, as if waiting to be worn again. The notebook didn't leave Daniel's hands. He sat in the back pew of the orphanage's tiny chapel, the walls swollen with damp and the ceiling stained with time. Above the altar, the wooden crucifix tilted slightly to the left, as if Christ himself had turned his face away. Daniel didn't, so know what he was waiting for. Maybe a voice, maybe a sign. What came instead was the cold, not wind, not draft, but cold that moved with intention. He felt it press against his spine like a hand made of silence, and then the humming. Again, low, sorrowful, familiar. That same wordless lullaby he had heard in his sleep as a child. Only this time, it wasn't in his head. It was coming from the hallway. He rose slowly, the notebook clutched tightly, and stepped into the corridor. No footsteps, just sound. He followed it, past the staircase, past the playroom door with faded paint and paper stars, to the infirmary. A room that hadn't been used in years. The door stood open. Inside, rows of rusted beds, empty except one. A single bed in the corner, perfectly made, white sheets, folded edge, a rosary laid out on the pillow like a body. Daniel stepped in. The humming stopped. The stillness was so sharp it hurt his ears. He reached for the rosary, but just before his fingers touched it, a whisper. "Don't." He froze, turned around. No one. But the mirror above the sink was fogged, just like Sister Maria's had been. And when he looked closer, words were appearing slowly as if written by breath. She sang for him. Daniel stumbled back, heart hammering. She sang for him. Who, the priest? Someone else? His mind was spiraling. He tried to speak but found his throat dry, like something was keeping the words from forming. He turned to leave the room, but now the hallway was darker. He stepped into it and realized the air had changed. The floorboards beneath him creaked differently now, not like old wood, like footsteps matching his own. He walked faster. The footsteps followed. He stopped. So did they. And then came the sound no adult should ever hear in an empty orphanage. A child's voice humming, the same melody from somewhere above. He turned toward the stairs, but the candle sconces along the walls were now lit, one by one, as if being ignited by invisible fingers. He ran up, back to the room where he'd found the notebook. It was no longer there, the mirror was shattered, and something was drawn on the floorboards in ash. A spiral, jagged, smudged at the edges, like it had been drawn by someone trembling. Daniel dropped to his knees, breath frantic. This wasn't just trauma, this wasn't imagination. Something had been left behind, and it wanted him to see. He remembered the drawing from the child years ago, the one they'd hidden, the face behind Sister Maria, the watcher. And then, from the end of the hall, a door slammed shut. Violently, not pushed, not blown, pulled. Daniel ran to it. It was the room at the far end, the nursery. He hadn't entered yet. He tried the handle, locked. He leaned in, resting his ear against the old wood. Silence. Then, "Daniel?" It was a woman's voice, soft, hollow, calling his name like a memory, like a lullaby. He stumbled back, chest pounding. How could she know his name unless it was her? Unless the child was right, unless she never left. In that moment he remembered something, the hymn book. He had left it downstairs on the chapel floor. He rushed back, 2 steps at a time, down to the foyer. But when he reached the chapel, it was gone. Only the pews remained, and the candlelight had turned red. He stepped forward and heard it. Behind him, a footstep, but heavier now, dragging. He turned slowly. The hallway was empty, but something moved just past the staircase. A flicker, a robe, a shadow. Then, unmistakably, a hand retreating through a door at the end. He ran after it, threw the door open. Storage room, empty. No footprints, no dust disturbed. But written on the wall, scratched faintly in the plaster, I begged him to stop. Daniel's vision blurred. The pieces were falling together. Something had been happening to Sister Maria, and she had kept it silent. For the sake of the children, for the sake of the church. And now she was still trying to speak, but not in words, in symbols, in voices not her own, in a melody that never truly ended. Daniel sits on the floor back to the door, hands trembling over the notebook. The rosary now lies beside him, but one bead is missing, as if it was never finished, and far in the E. Distance. The song begins again, but this time a second voice joins her. A voice Daniel doesn't recognize, lower, controlling. And he's singing with her. Did you feel that too, the sudden chill? The pressure on your chest? Then write in the comments, I felt the presence. The rosary. One bead missing. Daniel sat frozen, breath stuttering between shallow gulps of air, watching the thread of the rosary curl on the wooden floor like a question mark left by God. The hymn book was gone. The notebook was gone. But something else had appeared. He hadn't noticed it before. A faint draft, one he couldn't explain, rising from the west corridor. A hallway he had not yet entered. One that led nowhere. Or so he thought. The floor creaked underfoot as he stood, each step heavier than the last. The corridor narrowed unnaturally, as if the walls had grown inward over time, trying to forget the space existed at all. At the end, a door, smaller than the others, iron latch, no window, old but intact. The type of door that doesn't creak, it groans. He reached for the handle, locked. For the first time since arriving, Daniel hesitated, not from fear, from instinct. His hand trembled above the handle as something rose in him, a memory he didn't know he had. A smell of candles, a breathless prayer, a scream held between teeth. Then a click. The door unlocked itself. No wind, no movement, just invitation. He pushed it open. Inside was a small chamber. Stone walls, unlike the rest of the orphanage. No windows. At the center, a chair. Wooden, simple, with leather straps nailed to the arms. Daniel stepped in slowly. His eyes adjusted to the dim. There were objects on the shelf, things that didn't belong in an orphanage. A thick black Bible scorched at the corners, a glass vial containing a pale yellow liquid, labeled in Latin, a crucifix, broken at the neck, and beneath them all, a book, not a notebook, a diary. The name carved on the front cover, Maria. Daniel's hand hovered over it, unsure whether he was holding a relic or a weapon. He opened it. "Forgive me for not telling anyone. I thought I could pray it away, but it's growing stronger. He tells me not to speak, but I've started to write everything down. He comes when the children sleep. He says, I belong to him now, that my voice was promised. Sometimes I wonder if God is listening at all. I don't know if he sees me anymore, but I still sing because I'm afraid of what happens if I stop." Daniel closed the diary, eyes burning. This wasn't folklore, this wasn't superstition. It was abuse, sanctified, hidden, buried. Sister Maria had been left alone with something or someone dark. And no one had come. No one had heard her, except maybe the children, the humming, the drawings, the dreams. They were echoes of her silence. Footsteps sounded above, but they weren't heavy. They were soft, barefoot. A child. Daniel rushed. Out of the chamber, up the stairs, back into the dim hallway. The air was colder now, not biting, dead. He passed the infirmary. The bed was no longer made. The rosary, gone. The mirror, restored. He walked faster. Then he heard it, that voice again. But this time, she spoke, clear, desperate. "He's still here." Daniel turned. Standing at the end of the hallway was a girl, 7 or 8, nightgown, eyes wide, not afraid, just tired. "You're Daniel," she said. He nodded slowly. "She remembered you." "Who?" he asked. "The one who sang. Maria?" The girl nodded. "She stayed because of you." Daniel's heart cracked. He didn't remember her. He had left too young, but she hadn't forgotten. "She said if you ever came back," the girl whispered, "to show you this." The girl reached into her pocket and handed him a torn piece of cloth, blue, with a crude red spiral stitched in the center. Daniel's fingers trembled as he took it. She turned to walk away. He called out, "Wait!" But she was gone. Gone like breath in winter. He looked down. The spiral shimmered, not in light, in heat, as if it burned. He looked up, and the door behind him began to open, the same one that had led to the chamber. But this time there was no one on the other side, only a sound, singing, soft, but broken, as if someone had been singing for years with no one to listen. And now, someone was. Daniel clutches the spiral cloth in one hand, Maria's diary in the other. The camera pans out slowly as the hallway behind him flickers, lights dying one by one, and from the shadows, something moves. But it's not running toward him, it's waiting. Daniel stood motionless in the middle of the hallway, caught between the warmth of the diary in his hands and the burning cold of the spiral-stained cloth. The door behind him had opened fully now, but the voice was gone. No more singing, just the silence of someone who had been finally heard. He turned and stepped back into the hidden chamber, but something had changed. The chair was overturned, the shelf was bare, and in the center of the floor, a square of discolored stone, different from the others. He crouched down, ran his fingers along its edge, loose. With effort, he pulled it free. Below, a shallow pit. Inside, a wooden box, sealed with black wax, and a rosary wrapped. Around it so tightly the beads had cracked from tension. He broke the wax, opened the box. Inside, a bundle of pages tied with a red string and a cassette tape, the kind used in old voice recorders. Faded label. One word, Confessio. His fingers trembled as he lifted the first page of the bundle. It was not a diary, it was a letter, addressed to him. "Daniel, I prayed you'd never read this, and I prayed harder that one day you would. By now you know part of the truth, that I didn't leave, that I was taken, but not in the way stories tell. He was a man of the cloth, and I was taught to obey. But obedience is not the same as holiness, and silence is not always sacred. He made me sing for him, said it was for the children. said God needed beauty to dwell in suffering. I was young, I believed, and when I stopped believing, it was already too late. He told me if I spoke, no one would listen, that I'd be cast out, that my vows would be declared broken and my presence erased. But I couldn't leave, not while the children were here, not while Clara still held my hand at night, not while you were still drawing angels on the chapel floor. So I stayed, and I sang, until one night I refused. And something inside him broke. That's when I realized he didn't serve God. He served silence, the kind that hides behind incense and stained glass and calls itself devotion. And I knew then, no one would come for me, not the church, not the sisters, not the town. But I hoped one day you might, not to save me, but to remember me. Because the only thing worse than being buried alive is being buried unseen. You have the truth now. Do not let silence win again. Daniel's eyes filled with tears he hadn't shed since he was a boy. She hadn't been a ghost. She had been a prisoner, a martyr not of faith, but of fear. And now, she was asking him not for vengeance, but witness. He picked up the cassette tape, searched the room. In the corner, an old tape recorder covered in cloth. He placed the tape inside, pressed play, the hiss of old magnetic tape. Then, her voice, breathless, hollow, but unmistakably hers. This is Sister Maria. I don't know if this will ever be heard, but if it is, I want the truth. To be louder than his voice ever was. I know he's still here. I feel him in the walls, in the breath of the children when they sleep, in the mirrors that won't stay clean. I asked God to take me, he didn't. I asked him to stay with the children, I think he did. But I've stopped asking now. If you're listening, I said, please don't look for me. Just look at them. They know and they're waiting. Not for rescue, for remembrance. The tape ended, but Daniel couldn't move. Because in that moment he heard the sound again, not singing but weeping from below. He turned back to the pit, lit his phone flashlight, and saw it, a name carved beneath the wooden box, shallow and shaking. I am still here. And then the light flickered, the screen died, and the candles in the chamber relit themselves, one by one, as if someone had finally finished her prayer. Daniel exits the chamber slowly, carrying the letter and the tape. Behind him, the rosary on the floor glows faintly. The spiral on the cloth has begun to fade, not erased but released. He didn't sleep that night. How could he? The walls of the orphanage no longer felt like stone and wood. They felt like skin, like something alive and wounded, covered in scars made of prayers that no one finished. Daniel sat in the center of the chapel floor, cross-legged, with Sister Maria's diary in his lap and the cassette tape beside him. Around him the candles had stayed lit, though no one had touched them. The wind had picked up outside, but it never entered the building. It was as if something inside was keeping it out. By dawn he knew what he had to do. Not a ritual, not an exorcism, a testimony, one louder than silence. That morning he walked into the center of town. Snow clung to his shoulders. He passed the bakery where he once begged for change as a boy, the pharmacy where the old priest used to get medicine delivered every Thursday, always locked, always signed for. He walked until he reached the only place that still held power over the town, St. Jude's Parish, a small church, unassuming, but built on reputation. The doors were open for morning mass. He stepped inside. The congregation was already seated. Candles flickered. The priest stood at the altar halfway through his homily. Daniel waited in the back pew. He let him speak. He let the last hymn rise, and then he stood, holding the diary. My name is Daniel Crane. Some of you remember me. Most of you don't. But all of you remember her, murmurs, eyes turning. Sister Maria, you told yourself she left, that she doubted her vows, that she ran. But she didn't. She stayed. He held up the tape. And she spoke, gasps. The priest at the altar took a step forward. Daniel, this isn't the place. Then where is? Daniel cut him off. Because it wasn't in the orphanage, and it wasn't in the convent, and it sure as hell wasn't in the confessional, where she begged for help and was told to pray harder. Silence, tears, shock. But he wasn't finished. She suffered in silence, she wrote in secret, and she sang for someone who used her devotion as a cage. But she never lost her faith. You did. You turned your faces. You locked the right doors and opened the wrong ones. He walked down the center aisle slowly, placing the diary on the altar. Read it. Burn it. Ignore it. But you'll never be able to say you didn't know again. He turned to leave, but then paused. And if you still believe she's gone? He looked back at the crucifix. Then tell me why I still hear her voice when no one else is speaking. Daniel left the church. He never looked back. But the diary stayed, and later that day so did the sheriff and the bishop and the mayor's wife, and by nightfall, the tape had been copied. Not shared online, not broadcast, passed quietly from hand to hand, from story to story, from pain to remembrance. Back at the orphanage, Daniel returned one last time. He stood in the chapel alone, the pews empty, the candles out, but the air lighter, as if something had been lifted. He knelt where Sister Maria once sat and placed a single object on the altar, the rosary. This time whole. He had found the missing bead beneath the mirror in the infirmary. He didn't know how it got there, only that it had waited, like her. He whispered a prayer, not for release, but for peace. And as he stood, he felt something brush his shoulder, a breeze, a presence. He turned, no one, but the faintest scent of lilac lingered in the air. Her perfume, faint, real. As he closed the door to the orphanage for the final time, snow began to fall again, gently, not to bury, but to bless. From outside, we see Daniel walk down the empty road. Behind him, the orphanage, its windows dark. Its gates closed, but one window, just one, flickers with candlelight, and a shadow stands at the pane, watching, not trapped, not weeping, just remembered. If this story touched you, don't let it die in silence. Send it to someone who needs to hear it, because some songs were never meant to be sung alone. There are places where time folds inward, where prayers whispered long ago still hover in the air, clinging to the walls like smoke that never quite dissipates, where silence isn't absence, but memory. Millfield's orphanage was one of those places, and Sister Maria was never its ghost. She was its voice, its thread of grace still humming through cracked paint and broken pews, even after they forgot her name, even after they buried her truth beneath sermons and snowfall. She remained, not to haunt, but to hope. After Daniel left, the town began to change, not suddenly, but in murmurs. A candle was lit each evening on the steps of St. Jude's. No names were spoken, no sermons given, just light in glass jars, and silence that felt less heavy than before. The children who had drawn shadows now drew angels, not perfect ones, but ones with broken wings, wings still trying to rise, trying to. One of them, Clara, now older, painted something different on the orphanage gate. A swirl of blues and reds, childlike but deliberate. A spiral, incomplete, like a story still unfolding. Months later, someone reopened the chapel. They found the rosary still resting on the altar, untouched. Except for one thing, each bead had been polished, worn, as if someone had been touching them. Softly, night after night, not in fear, but in rhythm, in prayer, in song. One winter evening, a new caretaker arrived to survey the building. He moved room to room, marking what could be salvaged, what should be torn down. He found nothing of value. Until he entered the infirmary. The mirror above the sink had been cleaned, no dust, no streaks. And for just a moment, he thought he saw her. Not behind him, not in the reflection, in his own eyes. As if someone had left behind a part of their gaze, of their courage, of their ache, hidden in the very act of witnessing. He dropped his clipboard, and lit a candle, right there on the sink. He didn't know why, only that it felt right. In time, the town no longer whispered about Sister Maria as the nun who vanished. They spoke of her as the one who stayed, and her story traveled further than Millfield. Letters arrived from other towns, other women, other places where silence had grown roots. They said, "I remembered someone. I saw her too. I think this happened here." The spiral appeared again, on notebooks, on walls, on candles. Left burning in empty sanctuaries, it had become something else now, a symbol not of secrecy but of return. And though no one ever confirmed where Sister Maria's body rested, some believed she was buried beneath the chapel floor. Others swore she was never buried at all, that the snow carried her, that the trees guarded her, that the song she sang had become part of the wind. Daniel never returned to Millfield. He didn't need to, because in every place he went after, he listened to silences, to spaces between, breath and memory, and sometimes, just sometimes, when the world was quiet enough, he heard her again. That voice, that melody, sung not for glory, not for attention, but for truth. A slow zoom on the chapel's broken window. The candle flickers once. The flame bends left and then right, then still. Outside, snow begins to fall. One flake lands on the window glass, then two, then thousands. And in the whisper of wind that follows, we hear her, only once. A voice, soft as prayer. "I waited for you." They had always known. The sisters, the ones who remained in the convent after Maria disappeared. Not all of them, but enough. Sister Agatha sat alone, now, in a nursing home on the edge of Vermont. Her hands trembled from age, not guilt, because guilt had left her long ago, replaced by something worse, regret. She watched the snow fall outside her window. It reminded her of the night Maria left, or rather, was taken. And the letter she never dared send. She still had it, folded, unmailed, hidden inside a Bible she no longer opened. She kept telling herself it wouldn't have mattered, that the church wouldn't have believed her, that no one would have. But deep down she knew she could have saved her and didn't. The guilt didn't eat her like fire, it froze her, slowly. Now, all she did was wait. She no longer prayed, she just listened, because sometimes just before she fell asleep, she heard Maria's voice again, not singing, weeping. Sister Evelyn, once the youngest, had chosen silence differently. She had stayed in Millfield, retired from service and lived alone. But every Thursday morning she walked past the orphanage and placed a candle at the gate. No one ever saw her do it, and she never told anyone why. But the candle was always there, lit, unbothered by wind. One day a reporter asked her, years after Daniel's speech, if she believed Sister Maria had been a martyr. She didn't hesitate. "No," she said softly. "She was a lighthouse. We just refused to look." "And the children?" They carried her with them, not as a ghost, but as a question. Some grew up and forgot. Some never stopped drawing spirals in the corners of notebooks or humming lullabies they couldn't name. But Clara remembered everything. She became a counselor for children in group homes, and on her desk between files and forms sat a single framed drawing. It showed a nun in grey, kneeling in the snow, and a child watching from the window. The child held a candle, and in the flame a name written in crayon, Maria, fade in on Sister Agatha's old Bible, sitting unopened on a nightstand. Wind howls outside her window. The pages begin to flutter. The letter slips out, on the envelope. "Forgive me." The first letter came in a plain envelope. No return address, just 3 words scrawled on the back in trembling ink. She saved me. Inside, a photocopy of a diary page, different handwriting, same language, same pain, same spiral drawn in the margins. Then came another, then 20, then hundreds. From women, from girls, from places far beyond Vermont. and none of them asked for justice, only for voice. They wrote from convents, foster homes, boarding schools, and churches. Some wrote in English, some in Spanish, some in silence, just drawings, symbols, pieces of cloth, rosary beads wrapped in paper towels. But they were all saying the same thing. I saw her too. I heard the song. I thought I was the only one. A small grassroots project began. Not public, not viral, just sacred. One by one, women gathered to read Sister Maria's diary out loud. Not to retell her suffering, but to break their own silence. They met in old libraries, in church basements, in apartments barely lit. Some spoke between sobs, some didn't speak at all, just held candles and closed their eyes. But each time the tape played, each time her voice filled the room, something broke and something healed. One letter arrived addressed simply to Daniel Crane, witness. It came from a woman in Montana. Inside, a photograph of her, at 16, dressed in a choir robe, eyes hollow. On the back, a single line. I stopped singing when he touched me. I started again when I heard her voice. And in Ireland, a nun named Bridget began drawing spirals on the backs of hymnals. She said they were the mouths of the voiceless, that each one carried a name. And when asked how many names there were, she whispered, "Too many for ink." In Mexico, a childless woman adopted a little girl from a broken system. The girl never spoke, not once. Until one night, the woman hummed Sister Maria's melody, the one she had memorized from a bootleg copy of the tape. And the girl sang it back, perfectly, wordless but whole. By then, no one called it a ghost story. They called it a map, a path back to the voices we buried, a path back to ourselves, because what Maria left behind was not fear. It was permission. To speak, to remember, to confront, to survive. The spiral became a symbol, etched on old walls, painted near shelters, drawn in chalk outside courthouses, even embroidered quietly on scarves and robes, always hidden, always sacred. No one claimed ownership, no one profited, because the spiral didn't belong to anyone. It belonged to her, and to every other soul whose silence had been misnamed as devotion. Daniel kept every letter. He never responded. He didn't have to. Because each envelope proved what Maria had written was true. Silence may win the battle, but not the song. A slow zoom over a corkboard covered in letters, spirals, and folded prayers. A hand pins up the latest envelope. Then, another hand, a smaller, places a single candle beneath it, and behind them the hum of Maria's melody, faint but multiplying. There is a kind of silence that harms, the silence of things hidden, of screams swallowed whole by ritual, of questions answered only with tradition. That was the silence Sister Maria lived in. But there is another kind, one that arrives after everything has been said, the kind that holds, that listens, that surrounds pain without rushing it. That type of silence is what remains now, not in the halls of Millfield's orphanage, but in the spaces between the memories of those who walked through its shadow. The orphanage was never demolished. There were talks, petitions, arguments, but the town couldn't agree. Some wanted it gone, to forget. Others to preserve it, to remember. So it stayed, not as a monument, not as a shrine, but as a question. People pass it now with a kind of reverence. Some cross themselves, some leave candles at the gate. Others notes, "For the one who stayed. You taught me to sing again. Your silence was not your fault." The spiral has faded from the gate, weathered by wind and rain. But sometimes after snowfall, people say it reappears, not painted, not carved, formed by how the snow melts, as if heat remains in the wood, a memory of warmth or of presence. And inside the chapel, untouched, the rosary still rests. Someone cleans the dust. No one knows who. They say the candles light themselves on the anniversary. They say a humming is heard when no one's there. But only if you're listening for it, and only if your heart is willing to remember. Clara visits once a year, not out of obligation, but to sit, to listen. She brings no flowers, no notes, just her breath, and sometimes her tears. She places her hand on the stone floor where Maria used to kneel, and whispers, "I still remember." And always after a few seconds, the air shifts, not cold, not warm, just aware, like the room is exhaling with her. Daniel never spoke publicly again. He declined interviews, ignored requests, never. Wrote a book. He said everything he needed to say the day he stood at the altar with Maria's diary in his hands. He moved far from Vermont, found a small cabin, grew tomatoes, walked at sunrise. But in a drawer near his bed, he kept three things: the final page of Maria's diary, the spiral cloth now worn soft by time, and a small cassette player. He didn't play it often. Only when the world grew too loud, only when he feared forgetting the sound of her voice. And each time he pressed play, she came back, not in horror, in harmony. There was never a trial. No name was ever confirmed. The church said they'd investigate, but the world had already passed its verdict, not with laws, but with memory. And memory can be cruel, but it can also be sacred, especially when it refuses to let the forgotten disappear. Years later, someone asked Clara, now a woman, why she still visited that place, why she brought others, why she painted spirals on the hands of children in her care. She smiled softly. Because I believe in resurrection, not of bodies, of voices. And what of Sister Maria? She was never found. No grave, no remains, only echoes, only stories, only a melody hummed by strangers who'd never known her, but somehow felt her. She had become something else, not legend, not myth, but presence. The kind that lives in rooms where someone dares to speak the truth, the kind that lingers in mirrors cleaned with trembling hands, the kind that fills the lungs when someone finally says, "It happened. I believe you. You can stop singing now." They say the dead speak in symbols, that they don't knock, they resonate, they repeat, until someone listens. Maria never asked to be remembered. She asked to be seen. And in the end, she was, not as a ghost, not as a victim, but as a woman who sang through fear and taught others to do the same. The orphanage at dusk, empty, still. Then a single candle flickers in the infirmary window. No wind, no movement, just flame. And far in the distance, the softest hum, carried by snow,